The Pittsburgh Penguins shut out the Winnipeg Jets 3-0 to ruin Sean Monahan's Jets debut. Find out what went wrong on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Now, like I said, the Jets just finished their game against the Pittsburgh Penguins not too long ago. It was a 3-0 shutout and not for the good guys. Winnipeg honestly was just not very good. Winnipeg at 5v5, right? They weren't awful, and they created a couple of good chances here and there. But for the most part, the Jets just looked much as they did before they entered the All-Star break, which was slow, not really capable of winning second-chance battles, and sluggish, right? There was a lot of mediocrity in this game, and on the good chances the Jets did create, either they had a goal that was ruled offside, or oftentimes the players who perhaps lacked the elite finishing talent ended up being the ones to get the best scoring chances. And then you had a couple of moments where the Jets just flat out got robbed. So Winnipeg wasn't like the absolute worst ever, but they also weren't very good. And, after Brendan Dillon, unfortunately, got ejected from the game after trying to stand Nola Achari up at the line, ended up making contact with his head. It was a pretty clear 5-minute major, even if it wasn't, it wasn't intentional, right? He wasn't going for the head, but he definitely leaned into it. And unfortunately, that seemed to turn the game on its head. The Jets were only trailing 1-0 at that point, but once you put Winnipeg on like a 5-minute PK, look, we all know how the story goes. Winnipeg's PK really can't stop much of anything, and the Penguins took advantage. Despite having one of the worst power plays in the league, it was enough to tip the balance, and it was a lead that the Jets were never able to really cut into. So an unfortunate situation. I thought the Jets really should have been better, and I was expecting a little bit more out of this team, especially coming out of a break, right? I know this team sometimes looks rusty coming off of several days rest, but I really felt like this was a time when you should make a statement. After a couple of really crappy last few games in which the Jets were just flat out outplayed, I thought Winnipeg would have a really good chance to come out, go on the road, and take it to the Penguins. But instead, the Jets just looked limp. I mean, it was the best way I could describe it. And even when they had good moments, it wasn't from the top players. And the top six just didn't really seem to gel all that well. Now, in terms of Sean Monahan's debut, I thought he was decent. It's hard to get a read on a player in his first game with a brand new team and a couple of line mates that are quite frankly alien to him, right? Monahan hasn't played with Perfetti and Ehlers before, and those guys tend to think the game at a pretty elite level. So, getting on the same page with how they pass, where to be for receptions, when to take advantage of tap-ins, that sort of stuff is not easy, and it's going to take Monahan some time to really get up to speed. But for my part, I thought he was fine. I thought he made a couple of nice passes, had a couple of decent scoring chances, nothing too crazy for a guy just joining a brand new team. And it's pretty much what you'd expect, right? Nothing that really stood out either way. I didn't see anything particularly bad from him. I also didn't really see anything crazy and amazing either. So in terms of like a Jets debut, it was just okay. I think the problem is that because Winnipeg, their top six kind of got killed out there, it was hard for him to really stand out and be impressive when both lines just frankly weren't really getting it done. It's hard to say that Monahan had the most impressive debut. But again, like I said, nothing that really stood out negatively and nothing that really stood out positively. He was just sort of, oh, all right. And that's totally fine. Your first game out of the All-Star break, a brand new team, it's not going to be perfect, right? So I'm not going to complain about it. I don't think that there was anything to really be upset about. I think there are bigger issues with the team, and we'll talk about some of those issues later on. But for Monahan's part, I thought he was just okay. He was there. He showed up. He had a couple of decent shifts, and there were some moments that I liked from him. I thought he had a couple of, smart plays, but generally speaking, just a relatively quiet debut in a performance where the team was generally quiet itself. So let's just kind of give him some time to settle in. We'll see how he handles things. I think he's still got way more to offer, and I'm sure he'll want to actually impress in the next game after the Jets were just pretty muted in this one. So overall, Winnipeg's game against the Penguins, just a frustrating one, right? It feels like a bit of a continuing trend the last few games where the Jets just haven't looked like they've had the skating legs, and it felt like the top line really wasn't performing well. The second line struggled, and the only players that were consistently creating chances were in the bottom six and perhaps some of the guys that aren't really your top-end goal scorers. Otherwise, it was a question of special teams, and we know the Jets are just going to lose that. There's no hope for this power play. It has been absolutely atrocious. It was, again, atrocious on the few opportunities it had. Even when the Jets created offensive zone time, they'd only ever have it for a couple of seconds at a stretch. So, yeah, the power play, something's got to give. I really do think that they need to make a coaching staff change there. I don't usually see assistant coaches being changed mid-season, but if the power play does not get fixed before they make the playoffs, that's going to be a really big problem. And I know the power play isn't the most important part of your playoff run, but for the Jets to really solidify their hold on this playoff spot and to make the dance, they have got to turn the special teams around and get at least one of these two parts back on track. Because as it is terrible. The PK sucks. The power play sucks. And when that is one of the bigger weapons in your arsenal for a team that, hasn't really been scoring at even strength as much, yeah, you have to have something that's at least league average in one of these categories, and neither are. So a tough loss, some big lessons for Bones to take away, and one of those is that I really feel he needs to change the top line again. I know that he likes Connor Scheifele and Vilardi playing together, but I tell you what, I don't think it's working. We know that this combo has had okay shifts in the past, but the Jets were at their best when Scheifele, Ehlers, and Vilardi were all united as a trio. Why the Jets got away from this, I don't know. But Winnipeg really needs to go back because this line was able to paper over, some of Winnipeg's other deficiencies. And we'll talk about why that is critical, not only for the top line, but also for the downstream impacts in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Happy Super Bowl to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. Obviously, for me, it's going to be a little bit bittersweet this year. The Jets or the Ravens haven't exactly had the playoff run that I was expecting. Neither did the Jets, if you're a New York Jets fan. But for the Ravens, I really thought this was going to be the season. But you know what? It is what it is. The Super Bowl is still something that I'll probably tune into because I love the commercials and the halftime shows. And you know what? Even though the Ravens got a fat L, you can still come away with a win or 3. Not only can you bet on who will win Super Bowl 58, but you can also place bets with FanDuel on things like the players who will score a touchdown, the number of total points scored, and so much more. So new customers, join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. That's $200 back in bonus bets if you win. So no better time to join than right now. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hello, friends. Welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are checking in on the Jets after a tough loss and a couple of things where Winnipeg probably needs to sharpen up before they continue the rest of this last stretch of the season. But before we talk about some adjustments the team desperately does need to make, let's talk about something really cool that the Locked On Network has put together. We have launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and you can also find it on Amazon Fire TV. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with our local experts and our national shows covering every league. Find the Locked On Sports Today channel now on Amazon Fire TV and YouTube. Circling back to the Jets, though, right, let's talk about the top line. The trio of Connor, Scheifele, and Vilardi just doesn't really have the I would say, the Riz, right? I hate to say it in that way, but like this trio just doesn't really have the chemistry. They haven't really been driving results. And while they've had a couple of good shifts here and there, overall, right, the net for this trio has generally been a lot more underwhelming than I think Bones and the coaching staff were expecting. And I'm not going to say that it's on any one player. Connor, I thought, since returning from injury, has looked pretty good. He's not really scoring, but he's still creating plays. He's had a couple of nice defensive plays, and he looks generally fine, right, in terms of what we expect from KFC. But I feel like the big difference in what has kind of taken, I guess, the energy out of this trio is the loss of Ehlers. Nick is one of our most creative players, a guy who can single-handedly create offense on his own. And when you take him away from Scheifele, Scheifele's still really good as it is, but I feel like that explosive element of Ehlers' game and his ability to create space ends up not really, being something the team can replace with Vilardi or Connor. And that's not necessarily on either of those players. It's more that there's a stylistic change. And so for me, you've really got to put the top line back together. Scheifele, Ehlers, and Vilardi just destroyed together. And I know that they had a couple of games where they weren't really potting goals as often as they did when they first got put together. But that trio was an absolute monster and was able to drive offense at a rate that no other line on this team can, right? You look at the other trios that the team has tried, and none of them have really been as successful at winning, the goals battle and expected goals battle as efficiently as that top line did. And for Winnipeg, I think it's really important that they go back to it, because right now we're seeing what happens when none of the lines are really going. Even when the Jets create offense, you're seeing that there's not enough finishing talent to go around. There are definitely some really good players on this team, but a lot of them tend to be players who can create scoring chances, but not necessarily be the ones to capitalize on it. It's why I still insist that the team needs another winger. I know that it's not perhaps as high on the priority list as some have made it out to be, but I'm telling you, the Jets probably need a big upgrade for the third line. Somebody who's a big bruising finisher, or at least somebody with a high level of skill who can capitalize on chances. Because like Lowry, as good as he is at getting into those dangerous slot areas, he's not your number one finisher, and I think it has really reflected it, in some of his results. But we're not necessarily talking about the bottom six. We're talking about the top six. And I think we're also seeing that, in the very first game, Perfetti, Monahan, and Ehlers were just sort of okay together. I feel like obviously that trio will eventually kind of get it together and start to really hit pay dirt. But in terms of what's really important for this Jets team, I think you really need to reassemble that first line, because that trio was good enough to sort of mask some of the other issues. They were so good at driving offense and dominating zone possession that you could start to do that whole waves of pressure thing, which is something that we saw earlier this season, even before that trio got put together. And I think for Winnipeg right now, it's especially important because, let's be honest, a lot of the shooting percentages have kind of crashed back to earth. Winnipeg at 5v5 is suddenly finding it a lot harder to score recently. And if you had a first line that was dominating and finishing a lot more chances, it just, to me, doesn't really make sense why you would split it up. And I know that putting Connor back on the first line is what Bones has maintained the whole time, but you got to stop doing that. If it's not working, if it's not really giving you the best results, go back to something that's a lot more proven. And I think we had a much better sample size of the Ehlers, Scheifele, and Vilardi trio being dominant than we do with this grouping. So, look, if your second line is Connor, Perfetti, and maybe one of, Monahan or somebody else, that might actually work out pretty nicely. Now, I will say you do wonder a little bit about the defensive side of things, because like Perfetti is probably going to have to do double duty. And I kind of wonder, between those three, who exactly is going to be your transition guy, which is why I've seen some folks perhaps advocate for putting Connor on the third line instead. But of course, no matter what we say, that's never happening. So to be realistic, even just, changing it around where you have Ehlers in that first line, I think would soften up the competition considerably because they were able to win a lot more of their matchups. It opened up other opportunities for the third and the second lines to kind of get their punches in. With the first line, Winnipeg was rolling a lot more efficiently. They could take out some of the top matchup minutes against elite lines and wear down the opposition, and that softened up a lot of opportunities for your depth units to take advantage and score. Without that, though, the Jets have really fallen to just looking sort of average. I think this team is, in danger of not necessarily going on a really, really long streak of losing. I think a lot of people point to last year's January collapse, and they're like, oh no, it's happening again. I don't think that's the same case here, but I do think Winnipeg needs to change something up so that they get the mojo back and put this team in a much more competitive position. In terms of like what we saw with deployments in Monahan's first game, I will say that second line got generally more shifts than some of the Nemesnikov era line shifts, but perhaps not as many as he would imply, when he said that Monahan's going to get more snaps and stuff down the middle. So, look, overall, I'm just a little bit lukewarm so far on this performance, and I think that's kind of reflecting itself in some of my comments. And I'm trying not to be reactionary, but I do think that there are some things that right now are a little alarming, some flags that I think the Jets really need to address, especially because the second stretch of the season, this is where teams start to bear down. They start making trades. And Winnipeg's, perhaps made one of the biggest moves already. And, we're not sure that they're going to make any more necessarily. But all I can hope for is that the Jets are prepared for, the second stretch of the season, maybe making some adjustments to the lineup, some of the time on ice deployments, and being willing to experiment a little bit more to find those elite trios. But in the meantime, the Jets are probably going to be without one of their strongest defenders in Brendan Dillon. He had a rough hit on Noel Acciari that, like I said earlier, it wasn't intentional. He was just trying to stand Acciari up the blue line. Didn't really work because instead of standing up Acciari's body, he stood up his head, and that kind of left Acciari in a little bit of a dazed and confused state. I'm hoping that he didn't have a concussion, but hits to the head tend to be pretty rough. We'll talk about, Brendan Dillon's loss, who they can replace him with, and what, some buzz around, a potential Brendan Dillon extension. Is it something the Jets should be interested in? Should they maybe think about it a little bit more? What makes the most sense in terms of Dillon's either future or departure for his Winnipeg tenure? We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Sleeper. It's almost the halfway point of the season. We're just a little bit past it, and the Winnipeg Jets have had, some moments where they've won 8 straight games and some moments where recently they've lost 4 straight, and they've looked a little bit rough and a little more vulnerable. Regardless of where we are in the current standings, though, I want to remind you that you could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey because with Sleeper, you could win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. For those of you who are stats nerds and love tracking the top players, whether it's Makar, Ehlers-Scheifele, McKinnon, McDavid, Draisaitl, Vasilevsky, you name it, they've got the stats tracked, whether it's saves, goals, assists, and so much more. Well, it's time for you to put your tracking to the test. If you can beat Sleeper's projections, whether it's more or less than Sleeper's projections for a given game, you could win big. Because if you do it 8 times for in 8 different stats categories, you could win 100 times your bet. That's right, 8 correct stats categories for a given game, and you could win 100 times your cash. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your very first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on these closing thoughts tonight as we are wrapping up some thoughts. And obviously, the Jets are going to have a pretty big impact from the Penguins' loss. Aside from the sadness of losing 3-0 and getting shut out, the Jets are also likely to lose Brendan Dillon for at least a game. Dillon, like we said earlier, had an unfortunate situation where he tried to stand up Noel Acciari at the blue line, ended up kind of giving him what looked like an elbow to the head and probably a potential concussion. So let's hope Acciari's okay. He looked pretty stunned after the hit, not a good sign. And we don't really like seeing hits to the head. It's stuff that, quite frankly, has to leave the game. And like I said, Dillon's not a dirty player. It was sort of an unfortunate situation where I get what he was going for. He did kind of gamble a little bit on the hit, and whether or not he tried to hold up, it unfortunately doesn't really matter. He still made contact, and so the 5-minute ejection was pretty fair. Now, whether he gets suspended, more than one game, I don't know. I feel like, with Dillon, he's had edgier hits in the past, but again, like I said, he's not a dirty player. He doesn't try to intentionally injure people, and I don't think he had any sort of intention to do what he did in this instance. But at the end of the day, he'll probably have at least, a discussion with Dops. I would imagine at least a game. If it's more than one, that's not great. One game already is going to be a tough loss, but more than one game and you start to sweat a little bit. Right now, the Jets don't really have a lot of fill-in options. The most immediate solution is to put Logan Stanley back in, which, yeah, you can probably guess my thoughts on Logan Stanley returning to the lineup. Would really prefer to avoid that. The Jets otherwise would have to waive somebody and call up a player, which, hey, guess what? They still would probably have to do soon anyways because David Gustafsson is nearing a return. And obviously, I think one of the big players that we've been waiting to see this year after his whole injury hiatus earlier, it's Ville Heinola. And I've talked at length about why Heinola is really important to the future of this team and why I think he can be one of our most effective puck-moving offensive blue liners. This team really needs to get more speed on the back end, and I think Heinola adds a lot more dimensions to this team than most of the other defenders do, right? He's really quick with the puck. He makes clean passes. He's smart in possession. And you can debate the merits of his overall defensive marking, but one thing that is true is that when it comes to his ability to progress and transition the puck up the ice, there's really not many skaters on the back end for this team that have the skill sets that he does. Morrissey's one of the few. DeMello can occasionally do it, even though it's really not preferable. Pionk sometimes does it. I really wouldn't say he does it particularly well. Sandberg also kind of in the DeMello tier where he can technically do it and he can skate with the puck, but it's not really his game. Heinola really has a relatively unique skill set when it comes to this team's particular construction, and so for him to fill in, I think would be a lot more preferable, and it's a move the Jets would probably have to make anyways. Logan has done his time for this club and he's served admirably, but we all know that he, at the stage of his career, is more like a number 8 than a number 7. And having, seen what he's put together in his career so far, yeah, the less said about some of the lowlights, the better, if we're being honest. We know that his defensive work is not great. We know that he's not really able to take advantage of his size. And the offensive side of his game, which would probably be one of the strongest things, it's not really expressed itself at the NHL level at a degree that I would feel comfortable giving him more than like 10 minutes a night. So unfortunately for that reason, I really feel like the Jets should make the move and just go, bite the bullet, waive somebody and bring Heinola in, but I'm sure they're going to play it safe and do the Stanley move instead, which, yeah, again, it is what it is. Now, Dillon recently changed agencies for his representation, which was interesting, right? Because, he's one of the players who's going to be up for extension. And when it comes to what the Jets should do with him, I think it's a much tougher question. Especially coming into this year, he's really had a renaissance season where not only is he still doing really good defensive work, he's also added some surprising offensive versatility. I think the problem with re-signing Dillon is that he is on the older side. He plays a really hard tackle, very physical style that's most likely not something that's going to last super long. He's already played like 800 plus career games, but as you start getting into your 30s, this sort of style can wear on you a little bit. And Dillon's not the most fleet of foot either. I think the Jets overall kind of need to change the identity of the team to be a lot more of a puck possession and fast-paced team, one that's able to transition the puck up the ice really quickly, and Dillon doesn't necessarily fit that mold as much. He, unfortunately, is also kind of blocking one of the few sides where the Jets have a wealth of prospects. Winnipeg has a lot more left-sided help in the ranks than it does on the right side. So if Dillon was a righty, I would maybe feel a little bit differently, but I think at this point, right, Brendan's going to look for like a big 4 to 5 year contract, and at the likely cap hit that he's going to ask for, which could be as high as 4.5 to 5 million, I just don't really think it makes sense for the Jets to go big on this one. I love him. I think he's actually done a really good job, and on the whole, I think he's been a great player for the Jets, but I think he's one of the extensions where, you know, at this point, it's probably more preferable to elevate Sandberg's minutes and then slide Heinola on the third pair. And I say this again, as somebody who really likes Dillon, I just don't know if it really makes sense to put him into this team long term. Sandberg has already proven that, you know, when he's given the right partners, he absolutely shreds. Really, just keeping him from Pionk has generally been the most helpful thing. But Sandberg is super skilled. He's kind of become the heir apparent to Dillon in my mind. And I think going forward, he should be a lock for the second pairing. But as long as Brendan is here, that's probably not going to be the case. And I just feel like the Jets can't really afford to keep blocking roster spots for some of their young D. Not only because you need to give these young skaters more ice time, but also you have to kind of save some money somewhere. And if you can make your back end a little bit more mobile while also cutting down the cap hits so you can reinvest it in the forward ranks, I think you're going to have a much better time. But I'd be curious to know what you think. Are you expecting a Dillon extension? What do you think he might sign for? And are you even interested in bringing him back? Drop your thoughts in comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for thoughts ahead of Winnipeg's game against the Philadelphia Flyers. Let's hope the Jets make a few tweaks and come away with a victory against a team that occasionally has had our number in the past. But like I said, that's all the time that we have for today. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.